Thanks so much for doing this. Let me kind of got it right. And hey, oh, here we go. So welcome everybody. I know several of you very well, and several of you not so well yet. So I typically like to start specifically for PhD students with this very handy map about what you should call your professor. As I always tell my student, just call me Koen, right? As you can see in one of the decision forks, I did my PhD in California, so that's the that's the relevant part. Except for German students, they always have to call me Herr Dr. Professor Pauwels. That's the that's the fast and easy rule. So yeah, I mean, it's an absolute pleasure to be with you today. As I said to some people in the beginning, I was really happy with the invitation, but I didn't quite know what to talk about, in the sense that I didn't quite know what was most relevant to this audience. So I have a few kind of, options that I can cover, and I just like to, have this led by you. So if you say, hey, please stop here, Koen, I want to elaborate on that, or I want to see also what the rest of the room thinks, right? I mean, I don't have polls built in, but it's kind of interesting to see how any of the things that I may say or think jives or doesn't jive with all the things you have heard from your advisor and from other people. So here is kind of what I had in mind. We are talking about methods in quantitative marketing in this series. So I just wanted to kind of start with how do you actually decide which method you're using? Some research choices and situations in markets that I thought was very exciting when I did my PhD. And then, of course, maybe a brief interlude, depending on how exciting this is to you, about theory and causality. um, what I'm typically working on right now, kind of, commercially, is retail media. And so that is just the part that I see way more excitement in practice than currently in what I see in top journals and marketing. So I thought there may be a few kind of cool opportunities and research questions that we can share. And I'll give you one example of a paper in that Atlasmere, which we can discuss to what extent it respected the privacy of the people involved. Because it's basically tracking, if you researched, a certain product on an online retailer, did you buy it off that retailer? And so there's some interesting kind of, both ethical and modeling questions that come to mind there. But this is kind of the major ideas that I had for this 90 minutes, right? So let me just put it to you first, right? So when I'm teaching, I typically like to get the feeling for the room. So you have, you're starting a project, or you're in the middle of a project sometimes, and you have a research question, you have a data set, let's say. How do you decide on which method to use in your research?
I think you can write in the chat if you're not comfortable saying out loud.
Yes.
I think they're afraid of GDPR thing as well.
Here we go. Try and go ahead. I think you're on mute. Yeah. Yeah.
Can you hear me
Now
now?
we can hear
Sorry.
you. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think first of all, I will decide on like whether the method is the thing that my advisors are also familiar with, because they are the one who will work with me on the paper.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first one, and I also decide on for example, I based on previous papers who also use this, like who look into the same relationship more or less to decide on the method.
Okay.
Thank you.
Very cool. Yeah. So what your advisor is familiar with, and with what people previous published folks have done in your area. Other considerations? Let me just call, right? Alex, you just went off camera, but how do you decide?
I was looking out the window contemplating.
Yeah.
I mean, it depends, right? If you start with a data set, then that already is the method to some extent, right? Whereas you have observational data, so then you're kind of stuck in that world. I mean, ideally, I would like to start with the research question, then think about, do I go experiment? Do I go, like, do I find a company? But oftentimes you have to be sort of, just leveraging what you have. Yeah.
Very good point, right? So very often kind of we get a data set, and at the end I do have kind of some slides I presented with Rick Stalin on, hey, how do you start from the data and then you come up with things like theory and what is the research question, what is the method? And so you typically kind of recognize that because papers put data before the method. So if you're reading a quantitative paper and the data section comes before the method section, which is the case in just a few of mine, you know that I got the data and then I was like, well, based on the data, I decided what the method had to be. And I want the reader and the reviewers to also follow that thought process, because otherwise they will be like, why on earth, did you pick that one again? So yes, the data set can basically sometimes almost dictate, but in a lot of times kind of restrict the kind of methods that you could use in it. Yeah. Oh, very cool. Anybody else that wants to share? Okay. So I think basically a lot of the stuff has been covered, right? So I left, thanks for being so honest, Trang. I left kind of, hey, what my advisor is comfortable with, right? Whatever I learned, and this typically goes to this image of, you have a hammer and everything looks like a nail. And it makes sense, right? You spent 2, 3, maybe more years in quantitative marketing, learning a method very thoroughly. So of course you're naturally drawn to research questions, right? Which comes to Alex's ideal world, to research questions that can be answered with your method. Some people may say, hey, I don't know, we have this incoming editor of the best international journal in marketing, right? IJRM. So maybe I should choose what, he or she likes, or what the reviewers like. And a lot of this is, as I call it, whatever is in fashion right now. And I find as a PhD student, it's sometimes hard to understand this, right? So just like in consumer behavior, there's psychological theories that come in and out of fashion. In quantitative marketing, there's methods that come in and out of fashion. So when I was a third and fourth year PhD student in UCLA, people said, look, to publish in, let's say, marketing science, if you're not using new empirical industrial organization, you will never get in. That was just the wisdom then. And I haven't seen too many papers of that in, let's say, the last 20 years, right? So it's important to recognize that there's, even though at a given point in time, there may be some consensus that, oh, this is the new method that will replace everything else. That comes and goes. I remember very vividly, and this is recorded, right? So I have to be careful and anonymize it. I remember very vividly that there was this new method that came up, and some very prominent people in our field said, "Oh, this is completely gonna replace vector autoregressive models," right? So a method that I was known for in the beginning of my career. And so I was like, well, let's do it, right? And I teamed up with an absolute expert in that method. And we were analyzing something that was ideally fit for the methods. This is basically how advertising influences price elasticity, right? So your dependent variable is an estimate, and there's missing data, and you'd like some Bayesian updating. And so that person kind of says, yes, you write the paper, I'll estimate the method. So he comes back after about 2 weeks and says, okay, these are all the results. So start writing the paper. And I'm like, yeah, but you did a vector autoregressive model by quarter. So you just did this thing, right? Shouldn't you estimate this other method, which is so much better? And he's like, yeah, I'm going to do this, but it's going to take me 8 to 9 months. And you can already write the paper. And I'm like, why? Aren't the results going to differ by a little bit? And he's like, no, absolutely not. All of my experience shows that. And by the way, I need those things as my prior in my work. And I'm like them, if everything has been, decided to findings and I can write the implications, why on earth do you spend 9 months? And he's like, well, I also want to get published. So that's kind of an indication. By the way, that paper still didn't get published. So it's not a guarantee, if you follow whatever the current fashion is, right? So yes, I mean, I would say it definitely helps if reviewers and the editor have some familiarity with your methods, it's kind of a sweet spot, I think, right? They shouldn't be so familiar with it that they say, hey, this is just something you take off the shelf and it's too easy to estimate, right? Which you sometimes have. But if you use something that they're completely unfamiliar with, then that's also hard, right? You have to communicate a lot about exactly why this method improves over the other methods that you could use, right? I always have one reviewer to every one of my papers that says, can't you get the same results with a simpler method? The other two always, demand their own much more complicated method. But there's always one person, I always call him the Don Lehman reviewer, even though I don't know who it is, right? But they said, hey, why on earth do you have to do X and Y? Can't you kind of show me that you can also get the results in a much more simple method? So it kind of comes and goes both ways. And then, of course, this is what Alex said, what the data calls for, right? And so very often the data that you have, is it individual level? Is it more aggregate? Is the variation mostly in time or across sections? Will give you inspiration. And then, of course, as Alex said, ideally what answers the research question, right? So the ideal thing is that, hey, you work backwards, you have a certain research question, and from there you try to decide what that method could be, right? So here is just a few examples, and maybe the first one is if you too far outside of marketing, right? But to just give you kind of an idea. So does smoking increase lung cancer chances? What is the ideal method that you would want to use here?
Well, you wouldn't want to use an experiment, probably.
See, ideally, wouldn't that be cool, right? With a completely controlled experiment, right? Where you force a baby to start smoking from the beginning and the identical twin not to smoke. And then you follow them over 10, 20, 30 years, maybe even management science would think that that's a pure experiment, but ethically we can do it, right? So what do people actually do to get close to that one? I mean, the closest you can get, right, is, you try to get people who are as similar as possible on everything else, right? Risk-taking behavior is one of the things that come to mind. Other factors that may increase chances of lung cancer, right? And you may want to do some, whatever the latest is in propensity score matching to somehow convince the reader and the reviewer that, me and Alex are perfectly the same on everything else that you can possibly imagine, except that one of us smokes and one of us doesn't, all right? But so kind of, does this call for more individual level data or more aggregate level data, you think? So I would personally say, right, this is a perfect research question for individual level data, right? You follow the same customer around. One of the people that taught me, Peter Leeflang, so he showed us a paper back in the day that in the 1970s, this is in West, it was still called West Germany at the time, right? So he had aggregate data that shows that if you increase advertising for a certain brand of cigarettes, it didn't increase the market. It was just a market share switching thing. So and so he showed this to us as PhD student, and he said, look, I with that convincingly argued that we shouldn't forbid advertising for cigarettes because it doesn't teach anybody how to smoke or anything. It just switches market share. So if Marlboro advertises with their wonderful cowboy, they just get market share from the other brands. So there's absolutely no benefit for the public health to forbidding advertising. And needless to say, we were completely unconvinced with his thing. I was first of all like, why do we have to be 95% certain that it doesn't increase category demand, right? Also, the data he had was 1972, 1973, so just after I was born, and it was recession times, also in Western Germany. So maybe the category demand didn't increase because, cigarettes were already expensive, and that was something. And we're like, well, shouldn't you at least kind of have data on maybe just teenagers or just first-time smokers? And so there's all of these questions that came up because he was just using country level aggregate data about the overall demand for cigarettes. this is something that I've been dealing with Amazon Ads for 5 years, right? So who should you show an ad to online? So, let me, pick on somebody else, right? So Lina is happily browsing the web now. And so she comes to a website, and there's a bidding auction, of course, for her wonderful attention. And that goes in milliseconds, as you know, right? And so advertisers would love to figure out whether she's a high value or a low value prospective customer for them, and to decide how much to bid for the ad. What is the ideal data there?
Couldn't it be similar as to the smoking example? You also want to match me with someone who has very similar browsing history.
Exactly, right? So individual data are fantastic because we want to learn about you. And then, of course, the whole privacy things come, right? What information do I have about you? Is it only kind of first-party data that you have given explicit permission to that website to use, right? When you click on which cookies to accept. Have I bought a lot of data to match you with other third-party data sets? Am I following you around the internet with third-party cookies and so forth, right? So there's all of these privacy issues, but you will almost have to deal with it because the research question is just ideal for individual level analysis. Back in the time, I think this is now over 15 years ago, right? When Google in the Netherlands once wanted me to show something, and I'm like, well, this is absolutely fantastic, but I really need individual level data, and they didn't want to give it to me, right? And so I was like, there's just no way that I can satisfyingly to myself figure this out without individual level data. So we get this one, right? So are price promotions profitable in the long run? You may have read my very first dissertation paper. So what about this one, right? So you're basically advising a brand, and so they have been, kind of promoting a lot, and they do have data on stuff. So, and they wonder, well, on average, are my price promotions profitable or not? And then, it would be nice to also get some boundary conditions, right? So what do you think about this research question? Is this possible to analyze with, let's say, aggregate level data? So we don't know anything about, Lina and Alex and Michaela and trying as individuals, whether or not they took the promotion, and whether or not if they wouldn't have promotion, they would have bought anyway. But we have, let's say, data aggregated by customer segment or by store, right? And let's say you have it over, several years, and there's some weeks in which it was promoted and sometimes not. So here you say that for that level of research question, you could go either way, right? And so the overall question can be, I would say, very well answered with aggregate level data. If you dig deeper in the boundary condition, then it really depends. So it really depends on whether you want to make these boundary conditions about customers' characteristics or about stuff like talking about the weather or something else, right? So a very kind of, recent, well, not recent project, the project we're still trying to publish is we had this, fantastic idea that loss aversion completely doesn't work for price promotions, right? So if you're into the loss aversion world, that people react more to losses than to gains, it doesn't make any sense for price promotions, because what you see in aggregate data is that if you give 10% off 1 week and then go back to the normal price the next week. So if there was truly loss aversion in price, then on average you would have less unit sales, because people are more upset when you return to regular price than take the promotion, right? That's not what we see, right? I mean, you get more sales with the promotion, also in the long run, right? So then we were like, well, isn't there a better theory in psychology? Yes, there's regulatory focus, right? So Higgins has said, look, people can be either prevention focused or promotion focused. So they either see life as opportunities that you take or don't take, right? And then people have shown that if you're in a promotion-focused mood, you're much more likely to kind of take deals or take opportunities, upgrades to a higher-end brand that is now in promotion. If you're in prevention-focused mood, you want to avoid stuff, you typically see life as disasters that you either avoid or don't avoid. And so you're much less susceptible to deals for brands that you haven't bought before. And you may be much more upset with the price increase, right? So we're like, hey, this is fantastic. So let's look at all of the zip codes in the United States, but we don't have individual data. So we don't know for each of these consumers that are making purchase decisions themselves in their supermarkets, whether they're feeling promotion or prevention focused. Ideally, we would love to do that, right? I always say to reviewers who demand that, hey, ideally, I would love to have a little chip in everybody's brain that we can tell what you're thinking and feeling at any moment, but we don't have that. Maybe it's good that we don't, right? So what is the next big thing? So we go for information that brand managers do have. And for instance, one of the things is extreme weather, right? So our theory would say, hey, if the weather is pretty comfortable, right? I think Michaela said it was about 17, 18 degrees Celsius in Budapest right now. Then people are much more likely to be more promotion focused. Whatever your natural tendency is, there's a natural and there's a temporal tendency. If the weather is extreme, either way too hot or way too cold for the season, you're more likely to be in prevention focused, right? The same thing with recession and boom times. So in recession times, if you fear for losing your job and so forth, you're more likely to be prevention focused. In boom times, you're more likely to be promotion focused. And we're like, hey, this is an interesting thing, because if we ask, marketing practitioners and academics, should you give temporary price reductions in recession versus boom times? Most people say, oh, in recessions, people are more price sensitive. And then we're like, yes, but if you have to return your regular price, they may dislike it even more. So we actually find that, when times are good economically, people are more likely to basically give you a net overall sales, right? Of course, reviewers say, hey, but how do you know people are like that? And that's a whole other thing. But we're like, hey, we're answering an aggregate level question that managers have, and we're answering it with stuff that they can know while they're making the decision. So how will competitors react to my action, right? How much more sales if advertising doubles and so forth? So I think my latter questions are stuff that I would argue can be very well analyzed with aggregate level data, and give you some really cool information in that end, right? One of the, and this is the last thing I'll say about it. So at Amazon Ads, I was working with a fantastic colleague, Randall Lewis. So Randall Lewis is relatively famous for his paper on the near impossibility of measuring advertising returns online. I don't know if you read it. So this is on Meta, hundreds of thousands of consumers in randomized controlled trials. And then, pretty well, as far as I can see it. And I think it's an econometrica publication. So the reviewers also kind of did it, right? And he basically shows that because of the self-selection issue, right? So because Lena kind of was shown my ad triggered by her browsing to a site or having certain behavior, it's near impossible. It's actually impossible to, at a 95% confidence level, to say that Lena actually bought the product because she saw my ad. And so this was a big discussion point on Amazon, right? And we're like, oh my God, we have to get much better. I'm like, no, because the question is completely irrelevant. So working back from a decision maker, right? So if Lena is only one of my 3 or 4 potential customers, yes, I really care about this. If I have millions of potential customers, I couldn't care less whether Lena, with all respect, right, bought because of my ad. What I care about is if I increase or decrease my spending or change something else in my ad content, right? Let's say I increase spending by 10%. At the 95% significance level, do I incrementally get this much more sales? And is that then profitable for me? So a lot of questions that are asked, right, in practice, also in academia, what you may be intellectually interested in, are what I call aggregate level questions, and they are answerable with aggregate level data, which has the additional benefit that I don't have to know your identifying information. So if I do studies with aggregate level data, yes, you're part of it, right? But there's no customer identifier. There's no way when my data get hacked, God forbid, that your information will ever get out. And so my argument would be a lot of research questions that you may be interested in are answerable with these aggregate level data. So for those of you that like my kind of approach, right? So most of my models, not all, right? And I'll show you an example of machine learning later on, are with what we would call econometric time series analysis. And, Philip Hans Francis, right? The great economist said, hey, This is just a wonderful combination of the merits of econometrics, which focus on the relationship between the variables, which those of time series analysis, which specifies the dynamics in the model. So a lot of times, when I do research, I like to answer how much questions, as you know, what questions, and also I like to answer when questions. And one of the key reasons is that theory almost never tells you anything about when things are supposed to happen. I have put this challenge out so many times, maybe this group has it, right? So my claim is that there isn't one theory in marketing or in psychology that tells you when you can expect stuff to happen. The one I found in economics is the strong version of the efficient market hypothesis, right? So that one says every information that's publicly available about a firm will immediately and fully be reflected in the stock price. Right? And by the way, that's wrong. Empirically, I have seen no evidence of that one. But but that's a theory that specifies that it happens immediately. But most of the time, we just don't know, right? So maybe theory says that, hey, if you have a certain TV ad campaign that's emotionally focused, it's more effective than a rationally focused one. I'm making something up here, right? But if you have a new emotional campaign and you broadcast it as an advertiser, and nothing happens to your sales for 2 or 3 weeks, should you pull the plug on the campaign? Should you redefine it, or should you just wait because it just takes longer? So kind of this kind of modeling approach lends itself very well to these kind of when questions, right? What is really interesting, and I still think that this is, together with Kahneman and Tversky, right, the best paper in econometrica ever. So Sims in 1980, he basically compares this kind of modeling with structural models. And he refers to the structural models in economics at the time, right? So the one, if you have gone to general equilibrium theory, you know exactly what I'm talking about. There's these big theories in economics that claim to model the entire economy, and actually policymakers listen to it. So like, the people who set the economy for your country and the interest rates listen to that. And he's like, well, yes, I mean, they're there, but they have incredible identifying restrictions on how the key variables are allowed to behave, right? So there's causality implied, but never tested. And, there's always kind of one directional causality, never dual causality, and so forth. And so he came up with the vector autoregressive modeling that I like, right, as a way to overcome these problems. And so kind of his modeling put relatively less restrictions on it than the models that came before him. And I found this always very interesting. So an example, neuroempirical industrial organization, which was hot when I was a PhD student, it basically said, look, firms almost never give us their costs. And this is completely true, right? For all of you in empirical modeling with firms, you may get, a firm's marketing spending or impressions, and then their sales and other stuff. A firm almost never gives you their cost of goods sold. And you need that to give profit maximizing advice, right? You need to know their margins. So what this neuroempirical IO does to say, you don't have to ask the firm. If we just assume that firms and the managers behave, fully optimally, have a full information set, then from their behavior in the past, we can infer their costs. Absolutely brilliant, right? So you start from first principles, and then you say, hey, if only managers behave fully optimally and they have all the information, then from how they reacted to, random shocks in the past and how they adjusted their pricing and their advertising, we can actually infer what their cost of goods is. Now, I'm like, well, fantastic. If you have that research question, my problem is, and this is very personal as a researcher, right? And you may differ from your advisor on that one. I'm very uncomfortable making these two assumptions. I'm like, have you ever talked to managers in firms? They're definitely not fully, profit optimizing, and they definitely don't have a full information set. So for me, these restrictions, these assumptions were heroic, were incredible. And so depending on what you can live with, but I love the fact that there's a benefit, right? So if you can live with these assumptions, you can actually say something about the firm's likely cost structure. And I think when you're comparing methods, that's something really cool to do. Where does this fit this in? I love kind of this this pie chart. I don't know if you've seen it before. So within marketing, you know, you have the behavioral approaches. You have, you know, people that identify, right, as being in strategy. And then in quantitative marketing, you have this interesting, I would say, continuum from theory to empirical. And it depends who you talk to, right? If you ask to somebody, hey, this Professor Koen Pauwels, is he pretty theoretical or pretty atheoretical? It completely depends who you ask. If you ask a data scientist, they will say, oh my God, you know, Pauwels is so theory driven. If you ask a structural modeler in marketing, they will say, nah, Koen is very atheoretical. And so here is a continuing, right? So you can start from game theory, right? So you don't even have to touch data, as you know. And so, you know, you can have an analytical model of this. So, and basically, you know, you get sometimes some interesting things out, but you can only really get out when you put in. As a modeler, you have to think about all the contingencies and then see, right? You know, what we may call market response models, right? Or what econometricians call reduced form models that I often use in my series, right? You know, first of all, they try to describe the data patterns very well. And so, you know, people like me, Philip Hans Francis, I will mention his Journal of Marketing Research article on that briefly. We say, look, you know, there's three major kind of purposes of modeling: descriptive, prescriptive, descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive. That's a tough one, right? So we want the model, first of all, to do a very good job describing the data. And once you have that one, then we can trust you to maybe see if your model can predict well out of sample. And only when it can predict well out of sample and describe the data well, only then do we trust you, and you always have to make some assumptions there, to prescribe what the decision maker should do. And so that's kind of the approach there, right? Very interesting kind of counterpart is what we call structural models. And in the same Journal of Marketing Research special issue, this is 2005, people like Jean-Pierre Dubé, Bart Bronnenberg, they have this kind of their view on, look, yes, structural models. So you start from first principles, right? Typically, you assume some form of optimality or rationality. It's no longer full information set and so forth, right? You can relax these things typically one at a time. And then you really estimate kind of, then you bring the data to the model and you estimate it, but based on these first principles, right? And you use policy simulations. And then, of course, there's the field experiments, right? That I absolutely love. So, you know, maybe between empirical almost and behavioral, I love whatever model you use to actually put it to the test, to convince a decision maker to actually apply it. And then to come up with that one. And that's an interesting combination between kind of experimental and econometric considerations there, right? So I think with the paper with my advisor, I talk about meme. So model, experiment. In some of my best collaborations with industry, you know, I first estimated the model based on their past data that got them buy-in to do the field experiment. And then we modeled the fantastic variation in the field experiment. So one of the problems with reduced form models is that, you know, we're stuck with past variation in the data. So if the data you have just doesn't have enough variation, or there's multicollinearity, that's going to be tough. And so a lot of the times I look at field experiment or randomized controlled trials, like, you know, with Randall at Amazon, to kind of get more variation in the data. But then we still need a pretty good econometric model to control for a whole bunch of factors. So these are some of the considerations. So in the end, what matters is, you know, what do you think, right? So as I said, you know, really, I mean, if you're a PhD student, you're probably going to continue estimating these kind of models for a few years into your assistant professorship too. And yes, you can add, but, you know, you have to invest a lot of time into learning new models. That's just the case, right? So I think you better kind of do your dissertation and the first years of the rest of your career with the model that you're personally comfortable with. And so that came to my incredible instructions, right? What do your evaluators think? So I won't tell you, that doesn't matter. So to Trang's point, if you use a method that your advisor or that the journal you're submitting it to just really doesn't like or doesn't like anymore, that's also very important, right? But then think about what is really the purpose of your model or your whole work. Which model is feasible given the obtainable data? right? Observational, experimental. And then, whenever somebody pushes me for, complicating my model, it's like, yeah, but, what do we really gain by complicating it, right? It's not just because a model is more fashionable today that you have to force a poor author to estimate it in the review process. The reviewer will actually have to say what kind of, issues with the current model the new model will solve, or what kind of benefits to get, right? And some editors will really push back and say, well, wait a minute, right? The best, this will do is that it will take the author like 6 months to learn it and then 6 months to estimate it. So it will kind of prolong the process by a year. And the only thing it might do is make the error bands a bit tighter, right? A lot of better models, make your error lower. But there's almost no chance, even in the reviewer two's mind, that it will actually change anything of the main results or the implications. So there's some kind of pushback. Hopefully you will see sometimes with editors that say, hey, dear reviewer two, excellent proposal, yes, I like the model, but what does it really add given the purpose of the paper? So you see that one. Has any of these things come up yet for those of you who have submitted papers, and have you been successful or unsuccessful in pushing back there? We don't have to kind of push too much on it, right? Because if you haven't submitted yet, this will become clear soon. If you're a veteran in the process, some of the things may be too personal. Okay. So research choices within this, yes. I mean, you have to think about, how do you want your variables? When I teach this course in Norway, Tanat Peng took my class, right? There's actually a wonderful paper by Randy Buckland in a book called The Marketing Finance Interface, and he talks about being an expert witness. And that was basically, so I didn't kind of, typically I let the students read this one and give comments before they come, right? But the main story is basically about a franchisee that has sued a brand because they didn't do enough display in the store. And and so he was defending the brand because the brand was saying, yeah, but store displays don't have any effect on sales. So we were smart not to do it. And then the expert witness from the other side said no. And he had an econometric model when he had cumulative display days and cumulative sales. And so he regressed one on the other, and lo and behold, there was a significant effect. But that was only because he cumulated things. So you have two variables which are both trending upwards. And Randy comes in and says, well, of course. So if you take the first difference of them, if you have the actual weeks that they're on display and so forth, then you see there's no significant difference, right? So there's some interesting kind of questions there. And in my modeling approach, there's way to tell, when you should difference and when not. Temporal aggregation is always a big thing, right? So a lot of the data you get is weekly. In retail, why is that the case, you think? Why do people, and a lot of the papers I published are based on weekly data. It was not my choice. It's the data how I found it, but there is some justification for it. I don't know if you have been exposed to that one. So traditionally, right, in offline retail, so we know that all individuals, shop in different days, right? So picking on you guys again, right? Michaela may like to shop on a Monday, whereas Tanat Pang may like to shop on a Saturday. So what people do with their marketing actions, at least like price promotions, they always make it at least a week long, because otherwise I'm going to miss the people that have that as their natural shopping day. So the real reason that weekly data is so great is if all your marketing actions are at that level. If you want a paper about this, Jerry Tellis and Philip Hans Francis have a wonderful paper showing this. And they basically supplement Marnie de Kimpe and Mike Hansens. So de Kimpe and Hansens in 1995 say something about it. And Tellis and Francis say, no, that's wrong. And I believe them. So I think the Kimp and Hansen say, make it a consumer purchase cycle, right? So if you're analyzing fast-moving consumer goods, weekly is great. If you're analyzing people buying cars, it could be quarters and so forth. And so it's a consumer purchase cycle. Whereas Tellus and Francis says, no, it has to do with the variability in your marketing actions. It's really interesting. So they say, suppose, you have this big TV campaign, right? And you show it only on Tuesdays, but you show it every Tuesday. Now, I can aggregate to the weekly level because it won't mess up the legs and so forth, right? But suppose, sometimes you air the TV campaign on a Tuesday and sometimes on a Friday or on a Sunday. Now, if I have weekly data, I won't be able to distinguish immediate from the next week effects very clearly because you have masked the variation in the marketing action. And so that is what I typically use if you tell me, hey, what is ideal? The ideal data set is that one. So for instance, online, I very often work with daily or hourly, sometimes even minute data, because marketers vary their prices or their ad campaigns in these time intervals. And so you could make that argument, right? Another cool argument this was made before was, I think, Witting and Leeflang back in the days. They make the argument, they talk to decision makers and they say, hey, the brands say, the retailer needs us to put on our plans like 6 months in advance. So in terms of competitor reaction, for instance, so one of my work is if you give a price promotion that the competitor reacts and retaliates with the price promotion the next week, and they make the argument where the competitor is just not able to do that. And so if you can convincingly argue that these plans are set, then you can argue for bigger time intervals. Cross-sectional aggregation, I mean, very often, you have to work with the data you have, but going more detailed is so much fun, right? So if you have completely privacy respecting data by zip code level, then you can do very cool, they call it geo experiments, right? So you kind of have two zip codes that are very similar to each other, typically next to each other, right? But one zip code gets your ads and the other one doesn't. And so if people don't kind of cross over too much to shop, you can actually use that as a very cool cross-sectional control to make your statement, right? Dependent variable, right? So I think if you read my papers, you see I love systems of equations. So one of the ways to deal with reverse causality is to actually estimate an equation for it, right? So if you say, well, the biggest driver of sales of a new product is distribution. This is Ataman and Carl Miller. I was a reviewer on that one. Excellent paper. As a reviewer, I put my hands up in the air. I'm like, well, of course, but how can brand managers drive distribution? So add an equation that shows, which levers you can pull to drive distribution. So if you kind of make your boxes and arrows thing, every variable that gets an arrow pointing to it basically should or could be a dependent variable on its own, unless you have a way to kind of substitute that equation in the other equations in a nice way, right? And then you always have the question about what to control for. So I always say, well, we always are thinking about counterfactuals, right? If you do time series analysis, the counterfactual is typically, let's say, the weeks where you didn't do the marketing action. So you need a lot of historical data, and certain weeks they did something, other weeks they didn't do something, and that has all of these kind of things. If you do cross-sectional counterfactual, you may look at different zip codes or different stores that are comparable or different consumers, right, with propensity score matching. And so, you basically say, hey, this is how I can compare the effects. But you need to come up in your mind with kind of, what is the counterfactual for my research question that I'm trying to show? So I was just talking this morning to a company that claims to have I think they call it a cultural relevancy index. So they claim to not just know trends, but also which audiences really like the trends and it's relevant for the brand. And so they give me the data that they analyze like scenes in movies and TV series. And based on that one, they will show you specific ads. So I think the scene they showed me was Home Alone. And so the little guy is coming back from a shopping trip. He's wearing a hat, so it's obviously winter. And there's like toilet tissue and things in there. And so they're like, hey, this means that if you show an ad right away that deals with winter, or that is for charming, right? Then you can basically get some interesting information there. And I'm like, well, this is all great, and you have data to show it, but what's the counterfactual? How can we convince the reviewer that yes, you get more sales, but then, you know, we have to think about, oh, can we show the same audience that ad, but at a different time, to show what the impact of the right timing is? Can we show at the same time, but people who are not part of the relevant audience according to your tool? So as a researcher, you constantly have to think about it. So this is kind of one of the examples, right? So I typically start with, you know, what is the return on marketing investment? And, you know, we always have some shiny new thing. And then the question is, you know, the marketing guy is shouting it from the rooftops. The finance guy is like, you know, show me the money. Because, you know, that person knows that, yes, you know, typically in marketing department, we're like, hey, we should do this, you know, new thing, whatever it is, right? Gen AI, the metaverse, whatever the fashion of the year is. And we will get, you know, sales leads and everything, but we know that some of these things are also going to go down the drain and doesn't translate into what I call hard metrics, you know, like sales, profits, and share. And so these are some things to do it. This is actually a very annoying slide. This is the first company I consulted was Nissan. And this is how their marketing manager explained why they should give me money. So that may be and data. So he's like, look, you know, we have our resources, you know, this is all the way back in the early 2000s. I already did online marketing, right? And then there's a competitor, and there's all of these dynamic interactions and unknown feedback loops plus noise. So how do we model this? I don't know why the spring keeps on recoiling. So I don't make such. This is early 2000 animation, I think, right? So maybe, you know, just a few things about causality, because this keeps on coming back, and I find this absolutely fascinating. So I think, you know, one person from Sweden, actually a consultant, asked me on LinkedIn yesterday, because I was talking about retail media ads, and he's like, how do you deal with endogeneity? Or endogeneity, however you pronounce it, right? And I'm like, well, which one? And I listed like 6 potential sources. And of course, he was only thinking about one because that's what he specializes in. He had never heard about the other ones. But so this question kind of very often comes back, right? And I always claim, and correct me if I'm wrong, right, that there's just absolutely no way to perfectly show causality. I mean, there's always something that you can come up with, whatever method you use to say, oh, this is not true causality. And philosophers have been talking about this for centuries, right? I remember when I was doing my undergraduate in Belgium, you know, a philosopher said, hey, there's no causality. And I'm like, no, if I hit you and you hit me back, I caused you to hit me. And he's like, no, because when you hit me, there's a whole bunch of stuff that goes on in my brain. And then based on my, you know, past, you know, experiences, how I interpret why you hit me, I may or I may not hit back. So even then you can't say anything about causality, right? So, but there's several kind of ways. And again, this is to some extent linked to your data and how personal it is, right? So the late Sir Clive Granger, right, who talked at the Marketing Dynamics conference, by the way, he basically came up with this concept. He didn't call it Granger causality himself. People later on did that. But he's basically saying, look, in time series data, if you don't know anything else, and very often the kind of data I get are like that, right? So can we talk, and I call this temporal causality. I think that's probably better than Granger causality. It says, well, you know, in normal situations, right? Because you can think about exceptions. For X to cause Y, X has to change before Y changes. And that we can check in the data, right? And so a lot of times I do this. I estimate these kind of temporal causality because I have a whole bunch of interesting variables suggested by theory, but I don't know for a fact which ones are driving which other ones. And that's actually really interesting to find out. It drives the model you use, by the way, and the equations you estimate, but it also gives you very often kind of interesting things by itself, right? And so a typical application is, you may know me from online fights with Byron Schaub in the Ehrenberg Bars Institute. So he's a behavioralist. He's extremely influential in practical marketing, like companies like Mars, Panera now, they swear by his thing about how brands grow. And he's always saying that it's stupid advice to try to change anybody's brand attitude. So everything what Kevin Keller says you are, you know, or David Aker about, hey, you know, to get more brand growth, you should change people's attitudes. You should change, you know, how much they consider or like your brand. And he's like, that's all ridiculous. You should just change people's behavior. And then later on, they will say on a survey that they consider and like your brand. So his approach is, when somebody asks like 2,000 consumers in a representative panel of your country, hey, what do you think about Coke and Pepsi? And you can ask 120 questions. The people who have recently bought Coke or have Coke in their pantry, they're like, oh, we have bought Coke, so apparently we like it, so it's fantastic. And we haven't bought Pepsi in 2 years, so Pepsi absolutely sucks. So that's his approach, right? And with Grainger Causality, you can actually show this. So I have this very cool counter data set in Spain. And this is aggregate level, privacy respecting, right? Monthly data. I haven't published on it yet. So if anybody's interested. And so this is from like, I think the year 2000 to 2012 or something. And a very cool thing is, so we have monthly attitude metrics, right? So they ask several people about, do you like the brand? Do you consider the brand? And we have all the sales data by sub-brand. And so when Coke Zero comes in Spain, and I think it's about 2005, just like in in any other country, right? What do you think happens almost right away in terms of sales? Any Coke Zero drinkers here? Any Diet Coke drinkers? So what happens almost right away is that Coke Zero takes a lot of consumers from Diet Coke away. I mean, even me, right? So I got addicted to Diet Coke in UCLA. I think Jennifer Aker was always serving it because before I was only drinking the real thing, regular Coke, right? And then Coke Zero comes in, and so it's enormously successful. Almost all the guys in my environment switched to Coke Zero almost right away. Now, what is the fascinating thing that we checked? I checked what are the attitudes for Diet Coke. And so that's how I showed with Grainger Causality that Byron was right in this one instance, because so people they switch to Coke Zero, right? The first month, all of the brand attitudes metrics of Diet Coke stay up very high, because if you ask people, hey, how do you like Diet Coke? They still have a recent memory that they drank it, great taste, absolutely loved it. So even though you have switched to buying Coke Zero a few weeks ago, you still claim you like Diet Coke. And then month 2, month 3, you see kind of slowly, like a plane that runs out of fuel, you see the brand attitude for Diet Coke just diving down. And again, if we would have individual level data and we knew for sure, which customers have switched, it would be even better, right? But in the aggregate, you see a complete dip, but months after kind of the Diet Coke sales dip. So I'm like, in this instance, you're right. In most other instances, I actually do with Grainger Causality see that if people start, saying they like your brand more, it's a cooler brand or anything else, then you see a few weeks or months later sales increase. So is this pure causality? No. But if you can say to a decision maker, hey, you did X, and then controlling for a whole bunch of other stuff, right? Then, with a certain time like Y happened, then I think this is probably enough to be useful, which is kind of my argument there. So this is one kind of tool that I typically like to use, and it does give answers to some interesting questions in marketing and in economics about, what precedes what. And that's why I like to do this, right? So for instance, EB Games did that. So they ran all of their so-called KPIs through Grainger Causality text, and they came up with, hey, what are really marketers' leading indicators? So what are kind of things, if we improve them, will then increase sales? And there were things like consideration, competitive preference, inquiry, right? So people making an information request, trial, and initial sales value. That was highly predictive for the ultimate customer lifetime value. Then diagnostics, so they changed at the same time, were things like brand awareness. So for their data, they figured out that, hey, what people say, do you know this brand? That changed, at the same time. So very often people bought an EB games, and then in the same week they said on a survey, yes, we know it, but they had already bought it. So I think kind of in your research area, Grainger Causality, as I said, it's not, it's definitely not perfect, right? There can always be another variable Z that drives both X and Y. But it gives you some interesting kind of intuition, I think, about which kind of things to do. I don't think I will go out of this one. This is very the Kimball and Hanse 1999 kind of, what is evolving, what is not. I'll just give you one example I always give in my class, right? Which is the Affleck duck. So FLAC stands something for American Lifetime. It's additional insurance. It's the most boring service you can possibly get. It's basically, so you are employed and your employer pays for your insurance if you fall sick or you have an accident. But if you have this insurance and you have to pay for it individually, then they give you additional stuff like extra money, or they have food delivered to your door and everything. So in 1999, they told into some Manhattan ad agency, hey, can you come up with some cool ads? Because we have very low brand awareness, about 2%, and we don't have enough revenue. And this poor person, he was assigned this kind of task of trying to come up with a commercial for the most boring, thing ever. And then he went to Central Park and he heard the ducks quacking, quack, quack, quack. And he's like, hey, AFLAC, when you pronounce it, it says AFLAC, and it sounds like a duck quacking. So he basically kind of had ducks in their commercial, and the duck will bring you food and do stuff. And there's one very funny episode where the guy has ordered Chinese, and so the duck comes in with the food, and the friend says, "Hey, what did you order?" And he says, "Peking duck." And so these ads were extremely well appreciated, right? So brand awareness shot up, and they didn't change anything else. They didn't change their product, their price, and so forth, right? So kind of what is the return on duck investment, as I call it? If you fully attribute it to kind of the ads, right? Enormous increase in awareness, enormous increase in revenue. They get prices for it. So marketing people see this as a huge success. But it's also very, very expensive. And this goes to what we call evolving business practice. So you get to a higher level of performance, but you have to keep up that higher level of investment. If you drop it, then it goes back. And so they continue with a good response to these ads, making more and more ads. So they spent $450 million over the years on ads. So when I think in 2006, the new chief marketing officers came in, he's like, come on, we really need to continue spending? Please shut the duck up, because, that's, probably it's in people's long-term memory, right? And then they never gave me the data, but that's the kind of data you then need, and the variation to kind of then analyze when they stopped, using the duck and they stopped spending so much. What happened? Did their market share continue at the same high rates, or did it drop? And what is the profitability there? So there's some really cool, I would say, very high strategic level questions that you can answer with this kind of methodology. And then, yes, what I typically get is, you've seen my impulse response functions, right? That tell you, hey, let's say in the week of the promotion, you get this much more consumers. Then, you typically have a post-promotion dip. Some people who liked your product may actually buy it again. And these are the adjustment effects. And in this case, there's no permanent effect. A very cool paper I have with Rebecca Slaughtergraf in JMR talks about how does this differ by brand. And so if you're the leading brand, and this is data from the 1990s, right? This is, Chicago Kills data that you'll see used in so many papers. So Close-Up toothpaste is a leader in the US. They have this huge immediate effect, but all of their post-promotion dip makes it go down to just 1/10 of the immediate effect. So a lot of the sales are borrowed from the future. Whereas Rembrandt, and that was the first good tooth whitening toothpaste in the 1990s in the US, they have a lower immediate effect of their price promotion, but they actually have a permanent benefit. And so we have this whole thing about, hey, if very few people have tried you before, and you actually have a competitive product advantage, you could get that. By the way, the reason I know to look at Rembrandt is because when Jan Benedict Steenkamp was still in Tilburg, and I was in the US, and I said to him, hey, can I bring you anything? He asked for Rembrandt tooth whitening paste because it was not available in Europe yet. So this is sometimes how your colleagues or friends can get you to some interesting things, right? So I won't talk about this one or this one. So maybe something about theory. I think this is more relevant for this esteemed audience, right? So I have some blogs, and I think also a whole paper published somewhere about this relationship, right? Because people always say, hey, you need a lot of theory. And also when you're writing up your paper, you're encouraged, and some journals care a bit more about this, as to really come up with this beautiful unifying theory that explains everything, and you can make hypotheses from, and then you bring the data, and then, everything is beautiful, right sign, right magnitude, significant at any level, the ideal scenario, right? And so people are like, hey, if you just put empirics out there, how do we know it will generalize and so forth? And I completely get that. But as a contrarian, I'm like, yeah, you get this message all the time from everybody. So I should also kind of, highlight the other side, which is theory without data is blind. And we have a lot of situations where policymakers actually listen to people who are driven, and I call them strong theory folks. Whereas I think in a lot of cases, you want strong empirics. And there's so many ways that you can go wrong, right? A very typical kind of, I'm trying to come up with a really good example here, but I don't know, this betrays my age completely. If you ever heard about the PIMS data set, the Profit Impact of Marketing Strategy data set. So before we had lots of great data, I think it was some in the 70s, so even before my time, people had this data set about, company size and profitability. And so they basically analyzed this, without taking care of any dynamics. And all of the papers said, hey, bigger companies are more profitable. Fantastic. So the advisors become big. Whatever you do, become big. And it was perfectly aligned with theory, right? Because we have all of these economies of scale, of scope. There's so much great theories that tell you, hey, bigger companies can kind of, they can get cheaper things from their suppliers. They can force the supplier to move next door and just in time. They have an easier time attracting workers and giving them low salaries, right? I recently discovered that, let's say, a competing university in the same town as me, who is more prestigious, actually pays their professors less because they can extract all the rent from the prestige, for instance, right? So there's certain benefits. So theoretically, it made perfect sense. But so what do you think is a problem with saying, hey, bigger companies are more profitable, so if you want profits, you should try to become big? What is the problem with that advice? See, the theory is convincing, right? What would you say as a reviewer to that paper? That may be a good...
Probably indulgence.
Go ahead, yeah.
If it's not making profit, it will die early, will not grow big afterwards. So also reverse.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's a very good point. Thank you, Fabian. So I always say, this is my kind of pet peeve. I say, if you give time series advice, you should have time series data. Here is what I mean, right? So a lot of the stuff you see out there, also in the industry press, is, hey, company X is fantastic, so you should become like company X. So the promise is that if you dynamically over time do the kind of stuff, then you will get it, right? So in this case, at any given point of time, yes, big companies are more profitable, but that may be, think about a third variable, right? That may be because they just have a fantastic product quality. It may be because their management are so much better. There may be so many reasons why they started out small and became big that have nothing to do with economies of scope or scale. So when you now get the time series data, then you can say, well, what was the growth path of companies? And the companies kind of, and then you see, oh my God, there's several small companies who are actually very profitable. There's also a lot of small companies who are completely not profitable. And part of it is that, they used to be big, but then they had, problems with quality and so forth, right? So if, let's say, Boeing suddenly becomes a lot smaller, it will also be very unlikely to be profitable, by the way. So if you look at it over time, if your advice is, if your implication, right, that you're working towards is, hey, the company should stop doing X or start doing Y, then you better have some evidence in your data of that. And so lo and behold, and this is still all before my time, when people started analyzing the time series parts in PIMS, and you had it, I think it was by quarter or by year, they actually figured out that, hey, and then of course the other thing is, how do you become big, right? So if you do a whole bunch of tricks that have nothing to do with your product or your management to become big, it may actually backfire. So that's kind of an example that that empirics and time series data can really help you. So in marketing, and this goes to the Philip Hans Francis paper, right? The thing is kind of, what do you use things for, right? Is the purpose of your paper really to describe something better? Mike Hanses would say, to capture the data generating process. Are you really interested in kind of capturing things like dual causality in your field and so forth? And it's pretty new. So typically, you know, there hasn't been a paper and some more descriptive things, right, are very interesting, then that's absolutely great, right? So I'm looking now with Dave Reepstein at his country branding data. So we now have 8 years about, you know, the scores of countries, and we're trying to advise countries, hey, you should really focus on improving this one thing if you want to kind of do better as a country. You know, we first want to capture the data well, then we want to see if it predicts, and then, you know, you have the policy intervention, right? So you want to prescribe things, and then it would be really cool if you have kind of any evidence that other countries who are in your situation, who did the same thing in the past, also get that benefit. And so, you know, that's the paper I was referring to, right? So, you know, if you want to track the effects of variable doable changes in marketing actions, right? You know, it should be descriptive, accurately capture the data generating patterns. It should be predictive, and it should be prescriptive, right? So the counter argument, which I don't have, but in the same JMR 2005, Brandenburg, Dubé, and I think Phil Kassem say, look, you know, our structural models are better because they're so elegant. And so even though our structural models have a lower R squared and a lower out-of-sampling predictive ability, we still think they're better than yours. And I'm like, yeah, that's a very kind of personal, you know, you do you. Personally, I see them just like Philip Hans in stages. So I trust these things more. I also have an outstanding challenge to Tillim Erdem, right, which he hasn't come back yet, right? So very often when you start from theory and you do things from first principles, the promise is that you're less susceptible to the Lucas critique. Anybody has seen the Lucas critique or know what it means? So Lucas was this economist, 1976, right? And economists are much better at pointing to potential problems than coming up with solutions, I always say. So he said, look, you know, if you estimate anything based on past data, and then you tell the market players to change their behavior, then everything goes out of the window. Because the whole past behavior was built on certain things that they were thinking and their assumptions and decision rules. And if you now change something, right? So suppose that I find that price promotions are not profitable, and the company takes my advice and quits all price promotions. Consumers will change their behavior, because before they were in a regime that there were regular price promotions and they could stockpile stuff, and now suddenly the brand is no longer price promoting, right? So how can you trust things that you have estimated on past data for the future? It's a very valid critique, right? It's a lot less obviously what you can do about it. So kind of structural models in marketing, they typically say, look, because we start from first principles, right? Consumers are utility maximizing, companies are profit maximizing, and we bring it all together, and then we bring the data. We are actually, you know, less susceptible to that thing, because since you start from how people are generally behaving, and then so my challenge has always been, it has been now what, 20 years, right? There's hundreds of structural model papers published, you know, and I typically tell this to Tulim. I said, give me one example, just one, about kind of a structural model that is estimated on data before a major intervention that could predict well what actually happened after the major intervention. And she still can't give me one. So if you find one, please send it over, right? So I'm like, well, it's a matter of degree. It's a very fair critique, and it's very easy for a reviewer to basically slap that to your paper. But yes, I mean, every time you're doing any estimation on past data, you're always, and you're using it to prescribe, right? You're always, as I said, you know, assuming that the near future will be similar to the near past. And, you know, practically what I always do, if I give my model to decision makers, I always, you know, allow the manager to kind of make certain restrictions, right? So if my model estimates that every time you did an ad campaign, your competitor retaliated, and that gets into the net sales effect of this campaign, you know, maybe the manager has figured out that the competitor is in bankruptcy proceedings, and that whoever took over is not gonna kind of give the green light to an ad campaign. So in my decision-making tool that I give to people, you can kind of shut off that route. Or you can say, oh, the competitor is taken over by somebody who's extremely ego-driven and who wants to get market share. And I think he's gonna, I don't know, react twice as much as the previous guy did. So there are ways that the model plus the manager is better than just the model, right? That's a fantastic 1990 paper by, who's it, Bladberg and Hock, model plus manager. I always talk about it when I talk about AI now, and I'm like, hey, I think that humans with AI are still going to be way better than, you know, just humans or just AI that we have there. So Philip Hans Francis 2005, and that whole special issue in Journal of Marketing Research, and look at the you know, then the response by Bart Bronnenberg and GPW is just extremely enlightening, I think, still about what the different approaches are in quantitative marketing and how people trade these things off. Okay, so let me see where we are, right? I think we have 15 minutes. So I can talk a bit about retail media. I can also instead just answer any questions you may have. So